welcome. Thanks for coming. I know this is a front-end track, but I am kind of not really talking about front-end stuff. I mean, I'm talking about serverless functions, so it's pretty much all back-endy stuff. But I guess it's relevant to anybody doing front-end work as well. So anyway, I'm going to be talking to you about edge functions. How many of you have already used an edge function or even know what they are? You have used it? Sort of? Okay, do most of you even know what they are exactly? Good, okay. Good, then this should be good. Otherwise, it would have been terrible. No. So what I'm going to cover, so what are edge functions and why do you need them? They're relatively new, and there's a lot of confusion about what exactly they are and what they're useful for, so I'm going to cover that. Also going to talk about use cases for edge functions. Once you understand kind of what they are, you'll kind of figure out there's particular use cases that they're very good at and others that they're not as useful for. And then we'll talk a little bit about different edge function providers and implementation. The thing is that a lot around edge functions has to do with which provider you choose and what they allow, how their edge functions work. It's not the same across the board for different providers. So I'm going to cover a few to kind of give you some ideas about the different offerings that are out there. So, but before I do that, I really so most of the time I'm speaking at front-end conferences where I'm like the old guy in the room. So I always like to tell a story about how we got to this point because I feel like it's important. But before I get to that, I want verifying Microsoft Outlook. I don't even have Outlook. That's very strange. Okay, so who am I? I am a developer experience engineer at LaunchDarkly. If you haven't heard of LaunchDarkly, or feature flags as a service, but it's a lot more than just that. It's really cool. You should check it out. I also am co-author of the Jamstack Book from Manning. My other co-author is in the back there, Ray. I think it should be out this week, officially. But you can also get the ebook, and it's done. So there's actually a print version. Can you believe it? They still print books on occasion. So if you're interested in Jamstack, pick that up. And also, if you're interested in Jamstack, I do a Jamstack newsletter called Jamstacked. I also run a community called CFE.dev, where we have free events every other week. Well, now almost every week, with talks on a whole range of topics. Everything's free, so you should check that out. And I run also if you're in the Orlando area, I run a big community there called Orlando Devs. Okay, so what are edge functions? An edge function, this is a definition I wrote because I couldn't find a good definition out there. An edge function is essentially a serverless cloud function that runs on and is replicated across CDN nodes. So, to give you a better sense, again, of what that is, I want to talk about kind of how we ended up with creating edge functions. So I want to kind of take a step back and tell you a very simplified story of how we ended up developing edge functions. And I think that kind of ends up helping you understand what they're useful for and why we use them. So if you're as old as I am, I got my start back in the days when there was just a server, and your user would connect to your server, and that server could even sit in my office, or I might co-locate it somewhere, but it was just a single server. This is actually, some of you may recognize, this is actually the server that served up the first website, was at CERN. And I love this picture because it's got this sticker on there, I don't know if you can read it, it says, "This machine is a server, do not power down." So I even remember having some of my early websites running on just a single server somewhere. I might even share that server with somebody. So obviously the user would then connect to your one server, but this didn't scale up well when things got busy. So we started building racks of servers, right? Because we needed to be able to increase capacity. As the internet became more popular, our web page needed to be able to kind of have more capacity for more users. So we built these racks of servers and usually would co-locate them somewhere. I actually remember some of my earlier jobs, they were sitting in a room in the office that's where all our websites were served from. So that worked for a time, right? But the problem is like you end up building these server racks that had to meet the maximum capacity of your busiest day ever, right? Because you had to have enough servers to meet your busiest day. On most days, those servers were kind of wasted resources that were expensive and hard to maintain, right? So, and then even then, you'd have this like max capacity, and then you get hit with some unexpected traffic and bam, site's down, right? Because you had too much traffic and you didn't have that you couldn't anticipate. So we built these, we built we built the cloud, right? That automatically scaled up and down depending on your needs. So like when you weren't using that much capacity, we only charged you for what you were using, and it scales up greatly, right, to meet your needs on the busiest day. But all these previous examples, basically, you have a user who's connecting to the site, and they're getting information back from a server, a rack of servers, or even a server region that's in a location, right? It's in a single location. So in this kind of example here, my user is all the way across the globe and is connecting to your server region in the US. Like, this might be US East 1 if you're using AWS. So then some ideas came around, like for those of you familiar with like the static sites and Netlify, kind of came around. We started deploying actual sites to the CDN, right? So that was kind of like the little change that tools like Netlify started, whereas instead of deploying assets to a server, I was deploying them to a CDN because they were static and they could be served up that way, right? CDNs were made for delivering static assets. And this is great because like it was blazing fast. It was on a CDN that's close to the user, and it was static assets, and so it was going to be crazy fast. But we can't really build everything static, right? Like static sites don't meet the needs of that many use cases. So kind of came up with this idea. Okay, then we're going to turn it into Jamstack, or single page applications kind of follow the same model, right? Which is basically like I have static assets still deployed typically to a CDN, right? So I might deploy my static front end to the CDN, but all the data it's basically the dynamic data is gotten from a serverless function that's probably running still in US East 1 or something like that, right? Like I still deploy the back-end pieces to a single location. So it kind of looked more like this, where the user connecting to the CDN to get the basic assets, right? All the static assets might be served up from there. Jeez. Yeah, lovely. But then any API calls, like either that are called from the backend from my application when it's building or something, or from the client, like if I'm calling to get some dynamic data, is all still going to actually cross across to the server region where I've deployed my serverless functions. Right, my backend. Edge functions say like, okay, now let's bring all this up closer to the user, right? That's the idea. We're now taking these functions that were deployed to that region, and we're going to bring them close to the user on the CDN. So the idea here, you're thinking like it's just the user connects to the CDN, they get their static assets, and then the functions are also on the CDN, right? So as an example, this is a map of Cloudflare. I think they have like 216 or something different CDN locations. So if I'm a user and I'm getting using Cloudflare Workers, which we'll talk about later, I'd be served up the Cloudflare worker from the CDN point that's closest to me. So obviously there's a lot of them there, right? So that may sound cool, right? That sounds awesome. Why not, if that's the case, why not do everything as an edge function, right? Because they sound awesome. Well, the problem is like it doesn't fit every use case, because keep in mind that in most cases my backend has to get data from somewhere, and I can only replicate a certain amount of data to the edge. There are tools like databases that actually will replicate to different edge nodes and stuff like that, but And there are, as we'll talk about, there's ways to bring some of that data up to the CDN level, but in most cases, I'm not going to take all of my application data and move it to the edge, in which case I'm still getting CDN assets, the static assets from the CDN, and maybe I'm calling an edge function from the CDN, but that edge function is still going off to get the data deployed in a region. Yeah? Right. Yeah, there's lots of things. This is just an example. There are lots of pieces that may sit somewhere in a region, right? So like you've removed the latency in some cases, but then added it back. It still exists for like getting my data. It's still going to have latency. Getting any third-party stuff is going to have latency. So we've removed that latency. But if I can't move everything to the edge, that latency is still there. So it's really not that ideal for those kind of scenarios. And I mean, to be honest, in most cases, right, that latency of getting that, calling your serverless function in US East 1 is probably not the biggest bottleneck in your application. So moving everything to the edge doesn't necessarily, isn't going to suddenly make your application super, super fast. The other thing to consider is that edge functions often have a lot of limitations. Now, this depends, again, on the provider that you choose. But they can't always do everything that you can do in a serverless function. So they have a number of restrictions, and so that kind of limits the use cases for them as well. One of the things that I find more interesting than just say moving everything up to the CDN level is that an edge function can intercept the request kind of going in and the response coming back, right? So you can do a lot of interesting things if you think about it, and we'll talk about some of those use cases where you can modify the request coming in for some reason. Maybe you can check authentication or something and then change the request going in. Or you can modify the response coming back out. And there's some really interesting use cases for that as well. Yeah? There is caching. Yeah, we'll talk about that. There is caching as well. So, one of the things here that you can think about, for instance, is that I can do lots of heavy caching on my server response and but still manage to do some updates to the response that's coming back at the edge. Does that make sense? So I can actually do a lot heavier caching of my backend coming, so that it's much faster, but then add some personalization, for instance, at the edge and change that. Right? Or if you're doing Jamstack stuff, for instance, one of the things that I love is you can actually serve up a static asset, but then perform the dynamic stuff at the edge. So the page is actually rendered static, but there's pieces that I might change out at the edge. So that's another cool option for you. So to kind of sum up this piece, so edge functions, they replicate. I cannot say that word. Replicate globally, rather than deploy to a single region. So this is one of the key differences between your serverless functions. Serverless functions aren't, your regular serverless functions are deployed to a single location. They're not replicated. These are replicated to all the CDN nodes, right, or edge nodes, depending on which provider you choose. This can remove some latency by bringing that serverless computing up closer to the user. You can intercept the request and response, which makes for some interesting use cases. But they do have a number of limitations that you need to consider. And your data is not necessarily going to be there at the edge, as well as other things that you need to get, other pieces of your application that you might need to call may not be able to be there at the edge. So, and you have to consider that they can't do everything a typical serverless function can in many cases. Another interesting thing is I feel like there's a business case for why we created these as well, which is you had these big CDN providers like your Cloudflares and your Fastly's, and they wanted to get into kind of shove themselves into the game of the serverless backends. They had all these computing assets sitting at the edge that basically the only difference between them and AWS, for instance, was basically software running there. So now they're in the serverless backend game as well, right? They're like Newman shoving his way into Seinfeld's house. Anyway, So let's talk about some of the use cases of where this could be particularly interesting. A/B testing. This is one of my favorites. Like, I think this is a great use for it. So if you've ever gone to like a site that sometimes they'll have an A/B test and you'll see that quick flash of something change, right? Because they're changing something out client side because they're calling in some A/B testing service or something like that, and they change out the content very quickly. You might get that flash of rendering that you can eliminate that by replacing out the A/B test at the edge, right? You can update, modify, or add custom HTTP headers. Sometimes this is like, you'll check authentication and add some authentication headers or any other thing you might need HTTP headers. It's kind of a common use case. It's not something I've needed to do that often, but apparently people do. Conditional routing. So it could be like, remember I said you can intercept the request or the response. So in the case of conditional routing, I'd intercept the request and say like, oh, this person I'm going to send them off to a different URL, so they get redirected before, like, without any latency. There's no like server-side redirection or even client-side redirection. This is basically redirected at the request level and then pointed at the new URL. This is like, there's lots of interesting use cases for this. For instance, you could do like a progressive rollout of a site where you're moving people to your new version of your site, and they're routed at the edge to that new version kind of thing. So that one I think is a really interesting use case. SEO, so this is kind of similar to the conditional routing kind of idea. Is basically you can detect whether this is a search crawler and serve them up a different version of the site. Obviously not fake version, but you might have different ways you want to optimize the kind of content you're sending for SEO purposes, and you can send that back based on kind of, okay, this is a crawler, I'm going to send back this SEO optimized version. I don't even know SEO magic, so don't ask me how to do that. So user authentication and authorization, I can actually detect whether a user is authenticated at the edge, and then either like for instance, I might redirect them to a login, or I might personalize some of the content and things like that without having to do that either server side or client side. Right? This one is a big one. I don't do a lot of IoT and gaming development, but these are applications where like that little bit of latency is really, really critical. And like, can you imagine a game, like if I'm getting game data served up from the edge that's closest to me, that little bit of latency could be critical in how my game performs, right? So it's a popular use case for IoT and gaming. And I kind of talked about this a little bit, but personalization, like I can add, imagine I have like this cached or even static service response that I can actually then personalize at the edge instead of having to like convert that all to a SSR. I can actually add little personalization elements, as kind of similar to the A/B testing. If you ever go to a site, for instance, and then you see it says log in, and then it detects, oh, hey, he's logged in, and it flips it to like here's your personal information. So you get that flash of rendering kind of thing. Imagine you can remove that flash of rendering by just replacing out those pieces at the edge, right? So those are kind of some interesting. This one is a little bit interesting. This was given a use case. I talked to a friend who is deeply involved in this space, and he says that in some larger companies, there are compliance issues that are regional, right? So like you might have a compliance issue that you might be dealing with like in EMEA, that you want to be able to serve up a compliant version of the site for them versus somebody in another region who doesn't have those compliance issues. So you can kind of deal with some of these compliance issues by handling them at the edge. Yeah. No, yeah, feel free.
So a lot of companies have API management gateway products.
Mm-hmm.
And I see many of these options, many of these use cases in the space that potentially could also be solved by API management gateways, like Azure API, as an example. Where do you see kind
That's a really good question. So about using this over an API management service. You know, I'm not as deeply familiar with the pieces of API management services, so I'm probably not the greatest person to answer that question. You know, but perhaps actually, as if I show you how, like some of the options, it might make a little bit more sense of some of the things you can do that would be different. But yeah, I have seen it. I can tell you that there are a number of examples of using this in conjunction with like APIs, like as where your API has a serverless edge function sitting on the front that does some pieces for authentication and things like that. But I don't know how that's better or worse than API management software, to be honest. Sorry. Okay, so I do want to explore some different options, as I mentioned. You won't be surprised that AWS is like one of the biggest. I think they were among the first to get into this space, but I don't know exactly. They have the AWS Lambda at Edge option. It allows you to build with JavaScript using Node.js or Python. One thing to kind of understand is that is not, for those of you who've done Lambda, that's not the full list of Lambda supported languages. So you can't use all the other Lambda supported languages, those two. The key reason you'd use AWS Lambda at Edge is because it integrates with, I think, what does AWS have like now? 1.5 million other services or something like that on it. Something like that. I don't know. I can't ever find what I'm looking for, it seems, when I'm on there. So the limitations, it has a couple of interesting limitations. So one is you cannot update the body in origin response trigger, and I'll explain to you what the triggers are in a moment. You can only remove and replace it. The key thing to understand here is like some of those use cases like the personalization and the A/B testing get a little more difficult on Lambda at Edge because I can't change out the body. I can't actually access the body of the response to change, say, I want to change this header for an A/B test, right? I cannot access that. I can remove it and replace it, but I can't access what's inside the response body. They also, I don't know why this is the case, but it doesn't support environment variables, which I find kind of strange. So like my demo has my like key in it, or you could like during your build process replace it out. It does have a date. So all of these I'm going to talk about like where you can actually cache data at the edge. Almost pretty much all of them have a cache API, so that allows you to cache like assets and things at the edge. But not all of them have a data store at the edge, which allows you to cache data. AWS, you can use DynamoDB for that purpose. The other thing to understand about AWS Lambda at Edge is this is not deployed to the CDN. This is actually replicated across the 13 regions that AWS has. So your function is replicated across those regions, and the way it works is you hit Cloudfront, the Cloudfront CDN, and you're then routed to whatever the closest region is to you. So you can actually deploy serverless functions to the CDN level on Cloudfront. They have another service called Cloudfront Functions. But if you see that list of limitations there for Lambda at Edge, the list of limitations for Cloudfront Functions is enormous. Like you can't do most things. There's just like things like conditional routing and stuff like that you can do. You can replace out headers. Beyond that, it's very limited. So, and that's by design for whatever reason. So if you're going to do a lot of the other use cases, you'd have to use Lambda at Edge. So just to kind of give you a sense of how Lambda at Edge works, because of that architecture, because you're hitting Cloudfront and then routed to the server region closest to you, they have this idea of triggers where you can actually intercept the request coming in the viewer request before it hits, like basically when it hits Cloudfront, and then it always ends up hitting an origin server because that's the region where that function is replicated to that's closest to you, and then you can intercept it at different points on the way back as well. So you have to kind of choose which each of your Lambda at Edge functions are kind of connected to a specific trigger point in this process. And I'm gonna actually show you a little bit of what Lambda at Edge looks like. So this is just obviously running in the browser. I do have it locally, but it's kind of easier to show it to you here, although the text is kind of small. But this is, it's just a regular Lambda function. This one is a simple one that actually based on like an A/B test or something, or progressive rollout might send you to one version of a site or another, right? That's what this one does. I'm passing into this. It actually uses LaunchDarkly to do this, but I pass in your client IP as a key, and then it uses that to determine which version of the site you should see. One of the things that I think is worth noting about this is you develop these just the same way you would a regular Lambda function, but you have to test them using special event data, because there's like a Cloudfront event structure that gets passed into everything. So if you have anything that actually accesses any of that data, that's like, for instance, the IP or any of the other information that it passes, you have to test it using that. So what you do is you end up going here and you configure your test event, and you can, I'm going to show you just quickly how this is. There are templates here, so you would choose the CloudFront, one of these cloud HTTP redirect, and it gives you this is the basic event structure that gets passed into the Lambda at Edge function. So your typical Lambda function doesn't get this. It gets whatever data is passed in the request. All of this though does come to the Lambda at Edge function. So if you want to be able to access any of this data and test it, you're going to have to kind of replicate that event structure. So to show you what that's just, you create a test event like that, and then you just run. I mean, this one, as you can see, it just runs and determines, okay, you were going to get passed to this URL. And then this is the other interesting thing about Lambda at Edge. So each version that you then got to add the triggers, as I mentioned to you before. You're going to go to CloudFront, and you're going to do deploy to Lambda at Edge. And I'm not going to do that because this actually takes a long time, and it's kind of slow. But the thing that I find personally to be a pain in the butt is, let's say you update this function, you have to go through that process again and deploy it to Lambda at Edge, because what it does is that basically triggers the replication of the function. So you have to run through that every update. You have to kind of reconnect it to the CloudFront trigger and so on. So in typical AWS fashion, I find they're the hardest to use. But if you're on AWS, it might make sense. Cloudflare Workers is another big one. I think the Cloudflare Workers came out about a year ago. So obviously, a lot of people were using Cloudflare as a CDN. Cloudflare Workers was basically them offering you to be able to do serverless functions as on their CDNs. As I mentioned, there was 218 different CDN locations, so they have a lot. You can use JavaScript or any WASM supported language like Rust, C, or C++. Okay, so one thing you have to understand before I even talk about some of these key features is that Cloudflare Workers are different than, say, Lambda at Edge, in the sense that, in most of the providers, there's serverless function that's deployed to a region, and then there's edge function that's replicated across the globe, right? In Cloudflare, there is no distinction. Every Cloudflare worker is replicated globally, right? Every Cloudflare worker is an edge function. So, even whatever, if you build your site and deploy it to, say, using Cloudflare Pages, you can now deploy it to Cloudflare. And even in that case, every function serverless function you write and deploy to their system is an edge function, and it gets these benefits, which they say they have 0 millisecond cold starts, which pretty much every other provider, even AWS, there is a penalty, obviously, the first time you hit a serverless function. And Cloudflare claims, I have not verified this, but this is this is one of their selling points, is that there is no penalty for that first time that you hit these functions, it has a 0 millisecond cold start. They have something they call the HTML rewriter, which I think is actually really cool, and I'll show you this a little bit. But basically, HTML rewriter allows you to modify the response, and you do it in kind of jQuery like almost DOM traversal. So I can actually do selectors that select a DOM element within the HTML response, and then I can manipulate it however I want. I'll show you that in a moment. And if you, as I mentioned, if you deploy your actual site to Cloudflare using Cloudflare Pages, they have tight integration with Cloudflare Pages that makes it really easy to kind of build them as a single application. Just shove your functions into a folder, and they get deployed and replicated across the edge. Another thing about Cloudflare Workers is because there is no distinction between a regular serverless function and an edge function, there's not a lot of restrictions. I mean, they do have a list of restrictions, but it's pretty there's not a lot you can't do on a Cloudflare Worker. They do have their data store is basically a KV, a key value store that you can kind of cache data at the edge. So that I'll show you that in a moment too, because that's particularly useful for a number of use cases. Obviously, you're not going to replicate your whole database there, but you can cache some critical data that you might want to be able to access without any latency. Another kind of just interesting thing to note, because I do a lot of Next.js development. Next.js has this thing called middleware that they recently released, which is basically auto-deploys edge functions. Those edge functions, which are Vercel edge functions, are actually under the covers Cloudflare. So they're running on Cloudflare Workers. So if you're using Vercel edge functions or Next.js middleware, you're using Cloudflare Workers. Let me show you Cloudflare Workers a little bit here. So remember I said there's not a lot of limits. You can check out this page later, but they do have all the limits here. There's, I mean, even on their free plan, it's pretty generous. You can get away with quite a lot. The main limitation is on the body size, which 100 megabytes is still pretty large, I think. So you can do most things here, and on the number of requests and stuff like that. So you have some limitations there, but other than that, especially if you pay for a plan, there's not much limitations. This is a really kind of simple example. I'll show you a more complex example in a second. This is just kind of showing off the HTML rewriter piece, which I find kind of fun. This is my CFE.dev site, and you can see I'm just kind of fetching it. I am getting the HTML here, and then this piece here is, what you do is you create an instance of this rewriter, and you say, okay, when the rewriter hits, this is your selector. So in this case, I'm just doing an H1. When the rewriter finds that, you run a function, and this function then right here changes the text, right? So like I can do that on any element in the DOM. For this, I can use any kind of normal selector you might be used to with like CSS selectors and stuff like that, be able to find any particular DOM element and replace it out. And you can do all kinds of really interesting stuff like that. So then I modify the response and transform it. In this case, I'm actually fetching the whole data here, but in the case of like where this might actually sit in that request response, like that response is coming back from my server, and I go in and I tweak the response, right? Or it could be a static page on Cloudflare Pages or even on Netlify or whatever, and I can put this in front, modify that, and do that all at the edge. So you can really do some dynamic stuff that way. Another interesting, this is my Cloudflare one. So this one is another one that I wrote. This actually uses LaunchDarkly, has this Cloudflare Edge integration. That what we do is we synchronize any of your flag data, and we actually dump it in a KV store that's on the edge, right? And obviously, this is something you could do with your own data, right? It doesn't have to be LaunchDarkly, right? But what I do here is I'm actually injecting any client-side flag. So we have this distinction between client-side flags and server-side flags, but I'm injecting client-side flag data right into the page, right? So at the edge. So basically, on a normal case, you'd instantiate LaunchDarkly, it goes and it checks the server, gets the initial flag values, and then starts streaming them. And there's very small, I think it's like 20 millisecond delay, but you might get that flash of rendering kind of thing. In this case, I'm injecting all those values at the edge, and you have the latest flag values that are stored, that are actually in the client, right? So there is no latency, like there is no flash of rendering. It's immediate, right? So like as an example, oh, whoops, not Slack. Why am I opening Slack? Sorry. I meant to click this. This is my little page here that uses that. And if I go into like the browser dev tools, let me just here, okay. You can see here in the head, this is actually where I'm injecting right here. I'm injecting these LD flags values, so I'm just injecting some cache data. I mean, again, you could do this. You don't have to do this like just with LaunchDarkly. This could be whatever. You could do something similar. And then what I'm doing is I'm using those flag values to bootstrap the client. So you get it's immediate. Like it's at the edge. It's all injected. It's the most up-to-date flag values because those are synchronized with my KV store, and like for instance, I have this flag here that would toggle like showing the about us, right? But normally you would have see that little about showed up now, the about us section, and the content would be here, which it was hidden. Normally that you would have that little flash of rendering where it showed up and then I removed it. In this case, that doesn't happen because I'm caching values at the edge and then injecting them. Another interesting use case is out here. I'm also modifying all the headers, as well as like inject. I have some code here for. Not here. Here's the headers. Sorry, modifying the headers here, which is really easy. I'm just updating the response headers. In this case, I'm just kind of getting some values passed by the server and then injecting those, and one last thing I want to show here is basically, like I'm also, instead of just randomly replacing the header text, I'm actually doing an A/B test where it determines like, okay, this user gets this version, that user gets that version, and I'm using the HTML rewriter. Where is it? Oh, here. So I'm actually using the HTML rewriter to replace out text, right, for an A/B test. So again, lots of really cool things you can do with a Cloudflare worker. They also have like they have a cool playground you can mess around with and try this stuff out, and they have a lot of really, really good examples. Again, here, just to kind of give you a sense, this is where you can have multiple KVs associated with any given worker. So you don't have to like cache everything in a single KV. You can have different KVs. So and then you have also local like a caching API. So for instance, this KV here is actually my, oh no, it's this one. See, this is assets preview. This is actually caching assets at the edge. So like, for instance, I have obviously this is a simple example, but this is actually a static page, and that's cached. That static page is cached at the edge using their caching API, and all that caches and the KV are all replicated across CDNs globally, right? So as you can imagine, you can do some really cool stuff with that. Yeah, and then the last one I want to show off is a relatively new one, but I found it interesting, and it's called Dino Deploy. If any of you have heard of the Dino runtime, basically the folks who built Node went off and built this Dino that kind of they hoped would kind of meet what they had originally envisioned for Node, I guess, or wanted to take Node in a different direction. But anyway, and Dino Deploy is kind of like the business side of Dino runtime, and it's their cloud like edge function deployment option that supports JavaScript. It's also the only one out of all the options that I'm aware of that supports TypeScript out of the box. If you're really into TypeScript, it does do WASM languages and ES modules, which I don't even know exactly how that works within Dino Deploy, but if it's important to you. They also do JSX, like you can just kind of render JSX on the edge and then pass that back. So if that's important to you, be able to use JSX. If you're a React developer or something, you can actually use that within the Edge function as well. And they do have a fetch API and other things, so we can actually manipulate the DOM and do all that stuff for like A/B testing and personalization and all those things as well. They currently do not have a data store at all. They do have, they sort of have a caching ability because they have, you can actually store files at the edge. So you can have, if you connect it to a GitHub repo, you can actually have files in there that then get pushed to the edge, but you only have read access to those files. You don't have write access. So I can't, like within my edge function, actually write anything to the cache. I can only read things that might already be in that file store. So keep in mind though, this is, as it mentions in the limitations, this is still in beta. So a lot of this stuff may change in the future once it actually starts coming out of beta. So the nice part about it, because it's in beta, it's completely free. But if you are doing something production, there are some hard limits. I mean, they're somewhat generous, but if you hit those limits, there's no way to go over them and say like, oh, I'm going to pay, right? That's it. So it's kind of like be careful, because if you hit those limits, you're kind of screwed. There's also, any of you know about Supabase, which is like a Firebase, an open source Firebase alternative. Supabase is, well, it's pretty widely used. They just announced their edge functions, which actually behind the scenes are just Dino Deploy. So I'll give you a little sense. They have a really cool little playground here. Where is it? Dino Deploy. So I'm doing a similar kind of thing. One of the interesting things I couldn't get our SDK working in here for whatever reason. But as you can see, this is all TypeScript. They have a lot of like libraries you might be used to with like NPM. For instance, I'm using Cheerio for some DOM manipulation, so I can actually pull that into my edge function here. So if you're kind of used to the NPM ecosystem, it's pretty easy to pull stuff into Dino as well. It's not 100% of everything in NPM, but you can do most things, and even things that there's ways to kind of convert things that it doesn't already have in their kind of Dino land location. So I'm doing a similar thing here. But in this case, I'm using Cheerio to modify the response and replace out this text here. And I'm actually, this is not an ideal implementation because this gets into that latency issue here. I'm calling an API to get the A/B test to replace out that text. Whereas, like, so obviously I'm running this at the edge, but I'm going to hit whatever latency of calling that API, right? So you would, in theory, the best option here, if you were doing some kind of API call like this, would be to cache this. But again, Dino doesn't have a way to cache that right now. And here, this is just to kind of let you know in case you want to mess with it. These are the limits. So like for instance, if you hit this 100K requests a day limit, it's just gonna, that's it. There's no like, oh, I'm gonna call Dino and get more. You're just kind of stuck. So it is one to kind of like keep an eye on. I thought it was really cool, and it's free. So it's more like if you want to experiment. I think it's going to be an interesting offering down the road, though. Okay, let's see. There are a ton of other options out there. There's like, if you already use Fastly has their offering. If you're using them for CDN, they actually have edge functions as well. Fastly had some, well, actually I'm going to check my notes because they had some cool features that some of the others didn't have, but I just ran out of time to check out Fastly. But I want to tell you about them because they were really cool. So Fastly, oh yeah, this is cool. So Fastly has built-in device and location detection at the edge. So like it's automatically built into your edge function. I can tell what device you're on, or I can tell what location you're coming from without having to call any other APIs. So like if you have an edge function that wants to be able to do anything with device and location, that is a really cool offering. Flat.io is another interesting one because it's not really edge functions. You're actually deploying, like you can deploy a node application that's replicated across all their edge nodes. So it's a full node application, but I could use that as an edge function as well. I could create functions and have it do it that way, or I build a whole API that's then replicated across all their edge nodes. Azure has an edge offering. IBM has an edge offering. I'm pretty sure Google Cloud, although I didn't dig into theirs as well. So everybody's jumping into this space, basically. There's lots of interesting offerings, and again, they're all kind of different. It's not so easy to, like, say, compare apples to apples in many cases because it's all very new. Which do I recommend you choose? I'm going to kind of, like, as usual, it really depends. I think if you're already in AWS or Azure, it makes sense to kind of check out theirs because it's easier to use, kind of integrate within your own ecosystem. Or if you're using, like, Fastly or Cloudflare as a CDN provider, you can actually it's really easy to then start integrating some edge functions into your whole, like, workflow there without kind of changing your whole project, changing your whole stack, essentially. Cloudflare Workers are kind of the most interesting to me right now. I have some issues with Cloudflare, though, but I won't get into those. But as a company, but I think they're really cool. I found, to be honest, of the ones I think it's kind of obvious of the ones I showed you, I found Lambda at Edge kind of hard to use and missing some of the things that I would want to do with it. But if you are on AWS, it kind of might make sense for you to check them out as well. So I do have some resources. I will post these to my social media. If you want kind of more on how I did the caching and A/B testing and header replacement, I did actually write that out as a guide for using LaunchDarkly with Cloudflare Workers. It's kind of interesting even if you're not using LaunchDarkly. So I didn't talk much about AWS Cloudfront functions, but this article is awesome. AWS does, on top of being kind of hard to use, like if I try and dig into their documentation or any of their sites, it's like they like don't seem to want to explain to me what the heck each of these things is about either. So this guy wrote this thing that's like, I mean, for the life of me, it was hard to explain the differences between CloudFront functions and Lambda at Edge because AWS doesn't do a good job of explaining the differences or even the limitations of CloudFront functions. And this article, if you're interested in that, this article is the best. It even gives you a better understanding of capabilities of Lambda at Edge, even though it's talking primarily about CloudFront functions. So really, really worthwhile article. Yeah. So I mentioned that there are databases that actually replicate on the edge as well. Fauna is one of those. So they have like a tutorial here that that basically shows you. It is a promoted one, but it's a good one that shows you how you can actually replicate more complex data than, say, like just a key value store. You can actually replicate complex data on Fauna at the edge and then integrate that with Cloudflare Workers. So if your data is replicated closely, you can remove that latency if that's a really, really critical issue to you of removing that latency and bringing your data close to the edge. And then if you're curious about, I do a lot of Next.js, and Next.js middleware is kind of an interesting way of, what I find interesting about it is I believe Next.js is the only one right now of all those frameworks that has a way to deploy edge functions built into the whole process of building a site. So I just throw a middleware.js file into a folder, and that edge function will run before any request for whatever root is in that folder, if that makes sense. So if you know in Next.js routing, it's always like, if I have the pages folder, and then inside that, I might have like about.js, which is my about page, right? So, and if I had in that same pages folder, if I had a middleware.js that edge function will run for any of the routes that are under it. Right? So it's a really kind of easy way to start deploying these without having to learn the whole process of how each of these providers works. Again, that deploys on Vercel functions, which is actually Cloudflare Workers in the end. So it's kind of doing some dark magic for you. And I expect to see kind of more frameworks add these things in as we go along. So that's basically it from me. But I'm happy to answer any questions. I also have my DMs open at RemoteSynth on Twitter, or you can reach out to me at brinaldi@launchdarkly.com. I'm happy to answer any questions if you come up with those after this is over, but I'm free to answer any questions right now if anybody has any. Todd, you sound like you were thinking there. Like you're like, I'm going to ask something and then... So Dino is JS only. JS or JavaScript, TypeScript. The Cloudflare Workers, actually Cloudflare Workers, you can use, so you can use Rust, C, C++ for, yeah, I know. So yeah, it's primarily JavaScript. So yes, right now, primarily JavaScript. If you want to do like Lambda at Edge does let you use Python. So I think that's how I got shoved in front-end track, is because almost all of this, almost everything related to edge functions is like writing in JavaScript using Node. So yeah. So sorry, I know you want to avoid JavaScript like the plague. I know. So anyway, yeah. Anybody else? Okay. Well, again, you can always reach out to me if you want. Thank you.